Scientific inquiry or method. Science follows a logic. Every scientific discovery is based on the scientific method. It is very important to understand how this works. Scientists are kind of like detectives. We look for proofs, we test hypotheses, and look for proofs of observed phenomena. And with that, we describe and develop knowledge. Let me explain to you how the scientific method uh, is undertaken. This flowchart shows a simple way in which scientific investigation can take place. You start by making observations, then you ask a question, form a testable hypothesis, test your hypothesis, draw a conclusion, and communicate your results to the wider scientific community. Let's take a look on an example. Let's use the example of based on observation in the late 1800s, which was that everything started to change during the Industrial Revolution, which began around 1750. People found an extra source of energy with an incredible capacity for work, and that source was fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Though coal led the way, and these fossil fuels formed underground from the remains of plants and animals from much earlier geologic times. When these fuels were burned, they released energy that had been stored for hundreds of millions of years. There was a scientist named Charles Killing, Dr. Killing, who then noted that perhaps the Industrial Revolution promoted excessive burning of fossil fuels. And then he asked the question, is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increasing due to burning of fossil fuels? With that, he then formulated a hypothesis. Can the CO2 concentration increase between a certain period of time? So he needed to develop a testable hypothesis. So he set that period of time between 1950 and 2000. And another hypothesis that he wanted to test. Does the different types of carbon isotopes indicate the source of carbon dioxide? He wanted to see if the carbon dioxide that he measured in the atmosphere was coming from fossil fuels. Other sources of CO2 into the atmosphere is by respiration, and every living thing makes respiration and inputs carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. He was interested in knowing if the carbon dioxide originated from the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of coal, natural gas, or oil. So he tested these hypotheses, developed these hypotheses, and his next step was to test them with observations, experiments, and models that were developed specifically for those hypotheses. So he also needed methods for measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. He needed to determine the location and frequency of those measurements. He needed to understand how CO2 behaves in the atmosphere? Does it stay in the atmosphere? Does it diffuse into the oceans? Does it diffuse into space? What happens to this molecule? And then he started analyzing a time series of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and to investigate ways to determine atmospheric CO2 concentration in the past. So there's a lot of work on the testing part of the hypothesis. These two images here show the Mauna Loa Observatory in the Big Island of Hawaii, which is where Dr. Keeling, let me go back. You can see Dr. Keeling. There he is. This is where he decided to do his measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere. And he picked that spot because it is away from any source of pollution, atmospheric pollution. So the next step after you test your hypothesis, you start drawing conclusions. So in that step, the hypothesis can be accepted, can be modified, or rejected after very extensive testing. These are the results of Dr. Keeling's testing. The CO2 concentration in parts per million, ppm, on the Mauna Loa Observatory in 1958 and in 1959. So he measured CO2 concentration throughout those 2 years and then plotted on the graph that looks like this. And he shows then the peak and the minimum of CO2. So his conclusion was that CO2 can vary throughout the year. So that his first study was preliminary. He then shows the variation of CO2 and also that he can measure the CO2 in the atmosphere. With those results in hand, he then had to communicate them. And scientists communicate by publishing articles or essays that they write, and then they're read by other scientists, which are normally editors or contributing editors or other scientists of the same field that work for a scientific journal. The top 2 scientific journals, the most prestigious ones, are Nature and Science. There are several other scientific journals, but those 2 are the most prestigious ones. So once you finish your study, you write it up as an essay and you submit to a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And then other scientists of the same field, of the same expertise, will read your work and decide whether or not it's good enough to be in their journal. So there's a lot of rigor before the work is published. And then after the work is published, other scientists can repeat that study. They can continue testing your hypothesis. And with CO2 in the atmosphere, the study of Dr. Keeling, his hypothesis was continued to be tested. As a matter of fact, we're still measuring atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory. Here you can see a graph that shows the time series for atmospheric CO2 from 1958 to 2015. And then his hypothesis becomes more and more clear that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere, and that it has a peak. And every year there's a peak of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is shown by the red line, and that is related to the seasons. So during summertime, when we have green trees making photosynthesis, CO2 is removed from the atmosphere. During the winter time, when the trees lose their leaves, they're not doing photosynthesis, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and therefore you have a peak um, during the year, which is what he showed uh, in his first study. Here you can see the peak in May, right at the end of the winter. All right, so these are the steps of the scientific method: observations, you then ask a question, you formulate a testable hypothesis, you test the hypothesis with experiments, models, field observations, etc. You write up your study, draw a conclusion, and communicate the results on a scientific paper, and you get reviewed by your peers. I want to point out the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. So, a hypothesis survives many experiments, can be elevated to the status of a theory. So, a theory is a very strong statement. It is strongly accepted by the greater scientific community. Usually, we have theories on textbooks and hypotheses on peer-reviewed journals. For the example that we've been talking about, which is global warming, it has been elevated to a theory. There is scientific consensus that the Earth climate is warming. So, what was observed and tested back in the late 50s by Dr. Charles Kirling now has been promoted to the status of a theory. And then there's the difference between theory and a law. A law is a rule, it describes how nature will behave. The laws of physics proposed by Newton are examples of laws. The third law of biology, that all living organisms arose in an evolutionary process, is another law. And with that, I will end this video lecture on the scientific inquiry. So I hope that the point has been made. A scientific method is made of steps. These steps are carefully thought and developed by scientists, and in the end, they produce knowledge, a theory, and sometimes a law.